So the final stage of cellular respiration is oxidative phosphorylation. So remember that at the end of the citric acid cycle, all of the carbon was fully oxidized. So all of the energy was removed from it, and most of the energy was left in the energy intermediate NADH or FADH2. And so the final stage of cellular respiration is now going to take that energy and transform it into ATP energy, because again, that's how the cell likes to spend energy. So this is going to start with the removal of electrons, because remember, NADH stores energy by holding electrons. The process is going to require oxygen. Oxygen draws electrons, or you can think of it as attracting electrons, down a series of reactions away from NADH. So there's really two parts, and that's reflected in the name, oxidative and phosphorylation. The oxidative part is a series of redox reactions that pull electrons from NADH down to oxygen. So the electrons are going to go from NADH, and again in a series of steps, to oxygen. And that series of steps is called the electron transport chain. Electron transport means electrons moving from place to place to place. The second part of it is phosphorylation, and hopefully you remember that this is a phosphorylation reaction, taking adenosine diphosphate, so the A plus just two phosphates, and adding it to a free phosphate. And that is what creates ATP, which is the adenosine with three phosphates on it. And so this is going to involve an enzyme called ATP synthase. That means enzyme that synthesizes ATP. So the first part of it, again, as I said, is the oxidative part of it. And this is going to all start with the electron transport chain. It's a series of proteins and small molecules that are embedded into the inner mitochondrial membrane. So remembering our mitochondrial structure, you have your outer membrane, and then you have your inner membrane. That's kind of bumpy like that, my beautiful drawing. So the proteins that are embedded into the membrane can both accept and donate electrons. That means they can take and give away electrons. And they'll do this in series. They'll take the electron and then they'll give it away, right? Or pass it to their neighbor, right? So they accept. It's kind of like hot potato. If you remember that game from when you were a kid. You get the electron if you're in the electron transport chain, and then you give the electron away. This is all going to start with NADH and FADH2. So they bring the electron to the electron transport chain, and then that initiates the passing. So if I draw a very simple electron transport chain, these are the molecules in the electron transport chain. NADH floats over to it, and it gives an electron to it. So out comes the electron, and remember, when NADH loses an electron, it goes back to being NAD+. Now this guy has the electron. It took the electron, now it's going to give the electron away. So now this guy has the electron. Then this one has the electron, but now it's going to give it away. Now this one has the electron. At the very bottom of the electron transport chain, there's oxygen. And oxygen will combine with those electrons and hydrogens to make water. So we're going to make water at the bottom of the electron transport chain by combining the electrons with oxygen and hydrogen ions. So the electrons are moving energy as they're getting transported down this chain. And so they each molecule gains energy and then loses energy. And as it does that, it's going to do something else. So it's moving two different things. And I know this is a little bit confusing. It's moving electrons, which is accessing energy, but at the same time that it's moving electrons and accessing electron energy, it's using that energy to move hydrogen ions. So a different arrow here is going to move hydrogen ions from low concentration to high concentration. So remember, this is active transport. Going from low to high is having to pump the hydrogens against their gradient. So remember, that takes energy. The energy is going to come from electron movement. So here's a figure from your textbook. So here's my electron transport chain embedded in the mitochondrial membrane, or the inner mitochondrial membrane. It all starts when NADH, here it is, comes to the top of the electron transport chain and gives its electrons to the first part. So now this one has an electron, and NADH goes to being NAD. Now this one has the electron, it's going to give away that electron to the next part. This one now has the electron, then it gives it away to the next part. So I'm crossing out the electrons as they get given away. Then this one gives the electron, so crossing out that electron. Now this one has the electron, and then the last step is that the electron gets given to oxygen. So oxygen combines with the electrons and the hydrogen ions to make water. As the electrons were moving through here, energy was moving too. Energy was being released from this. And so that energy is being used to pump hydrogen ions from an area where hydrogen concentration is low to an area where concentration of hydrogens is high. So you need to know the locations of this. This is the intermembrane space, and this is the mitochondrial matrix. So hydrogen ions are being pumped from the matrix to the space against their gradient. Okay. So if I think about this as energy transformations, there was the chemical energy in NADH, and now that energy has been converted to gradient energy. Remember chapter 6, a gradient is a form of energy. Have I made ATP yet? No, but that's where we're headed. Okay. But before we get there, I just want to talk a little bit about how this relates to free energy, another concept that we talked about. So I said that NADH starts it all by donating its electrons, but oxygen is down at the bottom of this process waiting to catch electrons, or you can also think of it as oxygen pulling electrons down the chain. The reason why this is pulling electrons down the chain is because this is a very high negative free energy change. So remember, negative free energy, that means it's a spontaneous process and it's exergonic. So the reaction of NADH and O2 is a very highly exergonic reaction. But instead of releasing all of the energy at once, which would be like a big explosion of energy, right? And if you think about a bomb blowing up, yeah, there's a lot of heat energy there, but that's not going to heat your house for the winter, right? It would be better to take small amounts of the fuel in that and burn it over little every night, right, to keep your house warm. Well, that's kind of the principle behind the electron transport chain. Instead of having a big burst of energy, we have the multiple steps going from one place to another, to another, to another, right? The electron getting passed from here to here to here to here. Each time it does that, it's releasing a little bit of energy. That little bit of energy is used to pump my hydrogen ions, and that's more useful to the cell. Okay, so again, at certain steps along the electron transport chain, the energy from the electron movement is used to pump the hydrogen ions. That hydrogen gradient is a way to store energy. It's a form of energy, and that will later be used to make ATP. So here's a superimposed on a free energy diagram. So we have the free energy change. So we have a lot of energy here, and we have less energy when it combines with oxygen. Right? So here's oxygen pulling the electrons down. Instead of just having this directly react with this, which would be a huge free energy change, a lot of energy released, we have little steps along the way. So the first one is this much energy. The second movement of electrons is this much energy. The third movement of electrons is that much energy. Another small amount of energy. Another small amount of energy. So each time we get a little bit of energy, that can be used to pump hydrogen ions. And so the energy that's released from this exergonic process is stored in the hydrogen gradient. So the second part here is how that hydrogen gradient gets converted into ATP energy. So again, during oxidative phosphorylation, we had that chemical energy in NADH, which we can add on here actually came from glucose chemical energy. Right? So going back all the way to the beginning of cellular respiration, the glucose chemical energy was put into NADH chemical energy, and the electron transport chain has now stored that energy in a gradient. And what is now going to happen is that ATP synthase is this really cool protein that is going to turn that gradient energy. So I'm running out of room, so I'm going to move down here. It's going to turn that gradient energy into kinetic energy. Remember, kinetic energy is associated with movement. And then that kinetic energy will be able to be transformed into ATP chemical energy. So how does ATP synthase transform a gradient into ATP chemical energy? The best analogy I can give you is a wind turbine. So think about how the wind hits the turbine, and when the wind hits the turbine, it causes the turbine to spin. And then in a complex process, the spinning of the turbine can get turned into electricity that we can use to light our light bulbs, right? Kind of the same thing happens inside of ATP synthase. ATP synthase is going to let hydrogen ions diffuse. So the electron transport chain was pumping hydrogen ions. Remember, that's going against its gradient. ATP synthase now lets hydrogen ions diffuse. So remember, that means going down the gradient. So the hydrogen ions are going back the other way now in ATP synthase. And when they do that, right, it's like the wind hitting the wind turbine. There's a part of the protein that as the hydrogen ions pass through it, it spins. So ATP synthase is often described as a rotary machine. It actually has parts that spin. That's the kinetic energy. So the hydrogen ions flow like wind. They hit the turbine of the protein. That makes the turbine inside of the protein spin, forming kinetic energy. And then that kinetic energy is used to carry out the endergonic reaction of ADP to ATP. So this is a figure from your book or text. You don't need to know all the different subunits, okay? This is just overkill in information. This is a little more simple of a diagram that I like. It shows you where the hydrogen ions are high and where they're low. And because it's high on this side, hydrogen ions will diffuse through ATP synthase. And when they diffuse through ATP synthase, they cause this part of the protein, the little, my analogy being the turbine, to spin. That kinetic energy that's transformed from the gradient is then used to take ADP and add an inorganic phosphate to make ATP. So that's how we get gradient energy converted to kinetic energy, converted to the chemical energy in ATP. So this is putting everything back together. So here's my electron transport chain. Here's ATP synthase sitting right next to it. So the process starts when NADH comes to the electron transport chain and donates its electrons. The electrons then pass from one place to another, and as they pass, the energy that's released is to move hydrogen ions from an area where there's low hydrogens to an area where there's high hydrogens. So this is putting the energy that was in the electrons into a gradient. At the bottom of the electron transport chain, electrons combine with oxygen and H+ to make water. So water is produced at the end here. This is where oxygen is required. If you don't have oxygen, the electrons won't move through the electron transport chain and you won't be able to make ATP. And so when cells die because they don't have oxygen, it's really because they don't have ATP. That's the only function of oxygen in our body, is to be here catching electrons at the bottom of the electron transport chain so that we can make ATP. because that hydrogen gradient is then going to allow hydrogen ions to move back the other way. So notice they're getting pumped to the top and they're diffusing to the bottom through ATP synthase. As the hydrogen ions flow through ATP synthase, part of the protein spins, that's the kinetic energy, and that kinetic energy is used to make ATP. This is called chemiosmosis. This is when a gradient is used to do work. So the hydrogen gradient is being used to make ATP. So notice that hydrogen ions cannot normally pass through any part of the membrane except the electron transport chain and ATP synthase. So remember that hydrogen ions are charged, so they're going to have to pass through transporter proteins. So just to recap, right, we have glycolysis, taking glucose and turning it into 2 pyruvates. That extracts 2 ATPs from the glucose and 2 NADHs. So that's where some of the energy is going. The 2 pyruvates will go to breakdown of pyruvate, where they'll be converted to 2 acetyl-CoAs. That'll release 2 NADHs. And then the 2 acetyl-CoAs will flow into the citric acid cycle. The citric acid cycle will pull out 2 ATP. It will release CO2 as waste, which isn't on here, so let me add CO2s here. And it will put most of the energy into NADHs and FADH2s. All of the, so don't worry about this part here. All of the NADHs, so this one is becoming this one in case you're not catching that, will flow into oxidative phosphorylation. And oxidative phosphorylation will turn all of these NADHs and FADH2s into 30 to 34 ATP. So if I make 2 ATPs in glycolysis, 2 in the citric acid cycle, and all the rest of the energy is converted into ATP in oxidative phosphorylation, that adds up to a total of 34 to 38 ATP for cellular respiration. So when all of the energy is converted into ATP, that's your approximate total. So notice that it's not an exact number. Well, hydrogen ions don't exactly convert to an exact amount of ATP, so that's why we end up with this range. So most of the energy is flowing from glucose to NADH to the electron transport chain, which then produces ATP. Because again, you see here that most of the ATP is produced by oxidative phosphorylation. Cellular respiration harvests 40% of the energy in glucose. So that means 40% of the energy in glucose is converted into ATP. And so that doesn't seem like a big number. It's not even 50%, but it actually is really, really efficient. Just to give you an idea of how efficient it is, a typical engine in a car only captures 10% of the energy in the gasoline. So that is really not very efficient compared to this. The rest of the energy is released as heat and waste materials, and that's true for our bodies as well. So this number doesn't look super efficient, but in reality it is very efficient. So the last note here about cellular respiration is that, of course, we don't just eat glucose. We study glucose and glucose metabolism and focus on it, but we have many other sources of energy that we intake. And all of the things that we eat, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, can all be used for energy. They'll go through some parts of cellular respiration, but maybe not all of them. So for example, proteins are broken into amino acids, and then the different amino acids can be converted to pyruvate, they can be converted to acetyl-CoA, or they can be converted to things like citrate or oxaloacetate within the citric acid cycle. And then they'll go through the rest of cellular respiration and produce some ATP. Depending on where they feed in, they'll produce more or less, or rather less ATP than the 34 to 38 total. Carbohydrates, like remember starch, or other sugars like fructose, lactose, maltose, will all be broken down into sugars, into simple sugars, that then can feed into glycolysis and go through all of cellular respiration. Fats are broken down into glycerol and fatty acids that are then broken down into molecules like glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate or acetyl groups and feed into cellular respiration that way. So all of these different molecules will be converted into something that can feed into cellular respiration and therefore extract energy. So utilizing the same pathways is a very efficient way for the cell to harvest energy rather than having a special way to get energy out of fat, for example. The other thing that I want to point out is, of course, if you have plenty of ATP, so let's say you had that lovely lunch there, plenty of calories, and then all you did was lay around all day and you didn't use any of that ATP, you'd have too much ATP. And through feedback and regulation mechanisms like we talked about in the last chapter, your cell will not want to make any more ATP. And so if it does that, it will make these arrows go in reverse, right? So they will start taking things out of cellular respiration and sending them back to make fat or perhaps to make protein. Especially if you're working out, your body will want to make more muscle, okay? But all of these pathways can go in reverse if you have more ATP than you're using.